Explicit versus implicit understanding. The point of this episode is to give you a deeper understanding of understanding. What is understanding? Have you ever wondered about that? How does understanding work? It's a very mysterious thing. Understanding is not the same thing as knowledge. You can know, for example, that the Eiffel Tower is located in France. You can know that as a fact. That's well and good. Could be true, could be false. You could, of course, have a false belief, false knowledge. But that's not the same thing as understanding, to understand something. For example, when you understand how the engine in your car works, that's a different thing than just factual knowledge. There's understanding there when you understand how your computer works or something like that. Understanding is actually one of these things that we take totally for granted, yet we're using it all the time throughout life. It's actually a very mysterious thing, and it's hard to put your finger on what exactly understanding is because it's so vague and amorphous, and yet it's so central to how we live life. It's so important, and that's exactly the point, is that it's amorphous. So we're going to have to work with that. And this episode here is going to be just the beginnings of laying the foundation for understanding what understanding is. By the end of this episode, you're still not going to understand what understanding is, but you'll be a little bit closer. And to get you there, we're going to be talking about the difference, this distinction that I call the explicit versus the implicit distinction. There are really sort of two types of understanding, explicit and implicit. So what does this mean? Let's give you a bunch of examples and definitions. So explicit here, I just pulled these from the dictionary, just went online and pulled a bunch of different dictionary definitions for explicit. This is illuminating. Let's take a read here. Quote, fully revealed or expressed without vagueness, implication, or ambiguity. Fully developed or formulated. Unambiguous in expression. Definite, specific, and exact. Fully and clearly expressed or demonstrated, leaving nothing merely implied. Described or shown in realistic detail. Definite and unreserved in expression. Outspoken. So that's explicit. In other words, this is stuff that's concrete, that's material, that's manifest, that's actualized. These are all synonyms for that. Now let's contrast that with implicit. Quote, capable of being understood from something else, though unexpressed, implied, tacit, unspoken, not stated directly, involved in the nature or essence of something, though not revealed, expressed, or developed, potential, something is understood but not clearly stated, involved, entangled, suggested but not communicated directly. That's implicit. In other words, unactualized, unmanifest, or the essence of a thing, the amorphous essence of a thing. That can't be quite put into words. So of course, explicit versus implicit, this is a duality. One of many, many dualities that we've talked about. Definitely make sure you watch my 3-part series called Understanding Duality, where I give you a list of hundreds of different dualities and I explain how they work and how they reconcile and how they collapse. So the key here, lesson that I want you to bring in from that 3-part series is, remember I told you that all dualities must eventually collapse. And of course, that's going to be the case with implicit and explicit as well. But for now, before we start collapsing them, let's first work to separate them in order to distinguish them so that they're clear in your mind, because right now it's a confused mess for most people. So reality, of course, is both made out of explicit things, but also implicit things. And it's the implicit that I really want to focus on, because the explicit is kind of obvious and we all know about it. It's all the material stuff of life, the stuff that's just spelled out. It doesn't take a lot of intelligence or consciousness to understand. But then there's the implicit. So the problem here is that society and science, because these are collective social endeavors, both society is and science is a social endeavor, if you don't know. They both have a bias towards the explicit. Why is that? Well, of course, because when you're working collectively with other people, it's really helpful to be able to communicate and to express your understanding. Otherwise, how do we come together and create a set of norms? Or how do we build a consensus? That's what science is. Science is building of a consensus amongst a group of many people. It's a cultural activity. It's not merely measuring things. It's measuring things, but then agreeing on our measurements, agreeing on our standards of measure, and so forth. Agreeing on how to interpret what we're measuring. And then society at large, of course, we need to come up with laws, rules, ethics, norms for how to create a good, decent, peaceful society. And for that, we need to come to some sort of consensus. So there's this inherent bias just in the fact that we're being social creatures, that we tend to favor that. But that becomes a problem because then there's the other side of the coin, the implicit aspect of reality, which gets ignored because it's difficult to express, it's difficult to talk about. And so because of this, the implicit gets treated as less than, it gets denigrated. It gets treated as unreal, as imaginary, as a fantasy, whereas the explicit stuff is the real stuff, the hard stuff, the objective stuff. This creates a problem because this biases our understanding only to the explicit actually makes us dumb. Our culture conditions us to assume that everything can be explicated. And if it can't be explicated, it's assumed that it must not be true. Because, hey, everything true can be explicated, right? But how do you know that? Did you actually go through some sort of experiment to prove that everything true can be explicated? No, because you'd literally have to go through the entire universe to prove that. So clearly it was never actually proven empirically by science that everything that's true can be explicated. And in fact, the opposite is the case, which I'll be showing you with examples in a moment here. There are many, many things within reality which cannot be explicated ever. And in fact, there are many examples within science where this is the case. Many examples within mathematics. We'll be getting to that in a moment. So the problem here is that the implicit goes unacknowledged and undervalued in our culture. And all throughout school and as you were raised and the culture that you were brainwashed with has so skewed your mind to the explicit understanding that most people don't even know that there is such a thing as implicit understanding or implicit aspects to reality. So that's what this episode is working to correct. Try to comprehend this. Just because a thing cannot be easily shared doesn't make it any less true or any less important. And consider the possibility that there might be some things which are true in reality which can never be shared with anybody or ever communicated. Yet they are still true and they might still be very important. So if that's true, what I just said, that's a big deal. That's also a very big problem for us as a society, because if there are things that are true, but which cannot be spoken, well, how do we disseminate those things? How do we teach those things? How do we get other members of society to agree with us about these things? This becomes one of the core epistemological binds that we find ourselves in life, is that there actually are very important truths which simply cannot be shared, and yet they need to be shared because if these truths are not shared, then mankind falls into devilry and depravity and falsehood. And society becomes sick and dysfunctional. And yet at the same time, if you do share these truths, you can never share them. So you see, you're stuck in this bind. That's one of the whole tricks and problems with this work that we're doing with all the stuff that I teach in actualize.org is a lot of the things I teach are the implicit aspects of reality, which are difficult to share, which is why you didn't learn them through school and through your culture. Notice that you have many intuitions in your life that you cannot easily articulate. And yet, at the same time, honoring these intuitions and following these intuitions is crucial to your development and crucial towards truth-seeking, if you're interested in seeking the truth. So let's stop beating around the bush and give you an example so that you're clear about what I mean by implicit. So the best example that I came up with is the natural numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the integers that keep going to infinity. Now here's the challenge. Try to explicate the natural numbers. Try to make them all explicit. Let's try. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But see, you see the problem here. We can keep going forever. When do we stop? You can't ever explicate all the natural numbers. Why not? Because there's an infinite number of them. You'd have to explicate forever. So the natural numbers are actually, we might say, implicit. The infinitude, the entire set of natural numbers, is implicit because it generates forever. It's like a forever expanding object. Now, of course, this seems very obvious, and you might wonder, well, so what? What's the big deal? But here's my question to you. How is it possible that even though we all agree that even if you lived for 100 years counting numbers, you would never be able to explicate all the natural numbers? How is it possible that you're able to understand that the natural numbers are actually infinite? I mean, if you insist on being very strict, and there are these people who are really, who love to pretend like they're very scientific and very rational and very skeptical and very strict, no nonsense, just hard-nosed, no woo-woo stuff, no airy-fairy stuff, just very, very factual, objective people. These types who like to insist that everything be strictly proven and demonstrated and no mystical nonsense. So if you're that type of person, then how can you understand what infinity is? Because there's two facts here. Fact number one is that the natural numbers do keep going on forever. They don't stop. And you can keep explicating them forever. And fact number two is that you actually understand that. You understand that. So don't try to play dumb and say like, oh, well, we don't really know. Leo, we don't know. Maybe the numbers stop at some point. Because, maybe after a few trillion, it just stops. How do you know if you haven't explicated them all? But you do. There's an understanding that takes place here. That's what I want you to notice. You can take a child who is just learning numbers for the first time, and you can actually, if you did a very careful experiment, you can have the child like count up 1, 2, 3, maybe give him some marbles to count, one marble, 2 marbles, 3 marbles, 4 marbles, and then you can actually kind of lead him through that process, and then you can ask him like, well, when does this stop? How many marbles can we have? And the child will sit there and think about it, and then he'll have an insight, he'll have an understanding, he'll say, oh, it doesn't ever end. These marbles, we can have as many marbles as we want. It's infinite. At some point in your life, in your career in mathematics in school, you also realize that. So my question to you is, how did you realize that? Because if you're a stickler for only the hard facts, well, the hard facts are that no human has ever been able to explicate the natural numbers. So what I'm suggesting to you is just the fact that you're able to understand that natural numbers are infinite. That's already a mystical phenomenon that's going on. Your understanding of that. But you're overlooking it because you're just taking it for granted. Your mind or your consciousness is somehow coming into contact with something implicit, something transcendent, which are the natural numbers. And somehow the mind is able to grok it. Obviously, your knowing here cannot be explicit. It's implicit knowing. So how is that possible? Start to just wonder about that. That's a mysterious thing. How is it possible for you to know that? Stop taking that for granted. Stop assuming that it's obvious and that it's easy. It's like, oh, well, everybody knows that. It's just a matter of adding 1 + 2 + 3, and then you just keep adding more and more and more, and it's just, no, this is mysterious, spooky, mystical stuff that's happening. So your mind, is so clever that it's able to grasp a thing holistically, intuitively, implicitly, without having to go through every step and prove every step along the way. You can just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then by that point your mind goes, aha! I've grasped all of the numbers at once. I don't need to keep counting any further. I've grasped their essence or their nature. And that, I understand clearly, is endless. You see? So even though your mind is too finite to be able to count all the numbers, it's still capable of grasping infinity, this numerical infinity, all at once. But if I ask you, what are the steps? Show me the steps. Prove to me, explicate to me how you understand or how your mind grasped infinity in this case. You can't do it. Because when I ask you that, when I ask you to demonstrate every single step of how you grasp infinity, that itself would be infinite, you see. I'm asking you to explicate something that's implicit. Infinity is implicit. I'm asking you to explicate it, but you can't explicate it because it would take forever. But yet you can still get it. That's some spooky stuff that I suggest you stop taking for granted. And you start to contemplate and wonder about how that's possible. And just wonder at the amazement of it. That's an amazing thing you're able to do. Here's another example. There's something called transcendental numbers. Pi, E, and others that you learned in school. Humans know the number pi, 3.141596, whatever it is. Humans know that number to 1 trillion digits, decimal points. But here's the astounding thing is that no matter how far we calculate how many decimal points further, we're still never any closer to getting to the end of pi. I want to read you this quote from Cliff Pickover about this curious phenomenon of pi. He writes, quote, "In 1882, German mathematician Ferdinand von Lindemann proved that pi is transcendental, finally putting an end to 2,500 years of speculation. In effect, he proved that pi transcends the power of algebra to display it in its totality. It can't be expressed in a finite series of arithmetical or algebraic operations. Using a fixed size font, it can't be written on a piece of paper as big as the entire universe." End quote. That's pretty amazing. Just one number, pi, turns out to be infinite and endless. And what's even more amazing is that this German mathematician actually was able to explicate, or to prove, he was able to prove that basically pi is transcendental. That's pretty amazing. How is it possible to prove that something is infinite? Using finite symbols. Here are some more examples. A coffee cup. I got a coffee cup right here. Very simple object. And I might ask you, is this an object that we can explicate? Is this an explicit object or an implicit object? And you might say, and modern physics will probably tell you something along the lines of, very kind of simplistically, the materialist paradigm will tell you, well, yeah, Leo, here's a classic definition of an explicit object. Everything about this object, here it is, it's all known. In fact, what we can do is we can create a list of every possible fact about this object. And eventually we'll get to the bottom of it, and we'll have a complete description of this entire object, and that will be that. And we will know everything about this object. That's sort of the metaphysical and epistemic paradigm with which scientific materialism approaches that object, and basically the entire world. But it's patently false. That's actually not how it works. Because the list of properties of this object is literally infinite. If you want to make a list of all of the properties of this object, you're going to have to list how soft it is, how hard it is, how tall it is, how small it is, how big it is, how much mass it has, how much energy it has, how much electrical charge it has, how much heat it has, its temperature, and so forth. Then, after you get done with all those, you're going to have to start to list literally every position of every molecule in it. And you might say, well, so what? We can do that. I mean, yeah, it's going to be a very large list. It's going to be trillions of molecules that make up this cup. But we can, if we had a really good measuring system and a computer and a lot of time, we could maybe go through and actually calculate the position of every molecule in this cup, and then we'll be done, because supposedly there's a finite number of these molecules, right? Well, but that assumes that every molecule, that's the end. It just stops at atoms, but it doesn't stop at atoms. Atoms have subatomic particles. There's hundreds of subatomic particles. You can keep breaking them down further and further and further. And if you know a little bit about quantum mechanics, there's not even such a thing as a particle down there. Really, these are probability clouds, various quantum field equations. And of course, this cup, you're not able to understand what a cup is in isolation from its environment and from the entire universe. Because when you get to that very quantum level, the particles in this cup are entangled with the rest of the universe. See? And it's possible for you to actually become directly conscious that this cup has no bottom to it. It goes on forever. You can keep zooming into it more and more and more and more and more forever. This is an infinite cup. You can view it from infinite angles. You can zoom into it forever. You can zoom out of it forever. And you can list its properties forever. And no matter how much you describe and talk about this cup, you will never get to the bottom of talking about this cup. You could spend 1,000 years talking about this cup, and you will not be any closer to the end of talking about this cup. Now, of course, some wise asses here will say, oh, Leo, but what about the Planck length? The Planck length from quantum mechanics tells us there's a rock bottom floor to reality below which you cannot get. And supposedly at that level, everything is quantized and there's just like little bits, sort of like pixels on a screen. And once you, know what all those pixels represent, just like on a TV screen, then that's it. You have a full representation of the cup and there's nothing more. This is fantasy. This is not how it actually works. There's no such thing as a bottom to reality. Reality is bottomless. It's infinite. Now you might wonder, well, Leo, but how do you know it's infinite? Oh, well, here's the problem. You're asking me to explicate to you how I know infinity, but I could ask you the same question about the numbers, the natural numbers. How do you know they're infinite? You have to grasp it with your consciousness, implicit understanding, or intuition. So what I'll tell you about this cup is that I've become directly conscious that reality is infinite to the bottommost level. It has no bottom. The cup goes on forever. And what I'm suggesting to you is that you can become directly conscious, if you work at it, that this cup is infinite. But of course, this is not easy to do. This requires enormous superhuman levels of consciousness, which you don't currently possess because you haven't practiced it. But if you sit for 10 years in meditation staring at that cup for 10 hours a day, you might be able to do it. Or maybe take a psychedelic, you might be able to do it. So for now, just take my word for it. Although, of course, I'm not telling you this as a belief. I'm just telling you this as a possibility that you can prove for yourself. So I'm not asking that you believe me that this cup is infinite. I'm just kind of like giving you my conclusions here. You have to understand that what I talk about is just the tip of the iceberg of everything that I know and all the work that I've done. I can't possibly give you all the work that I've done and everything that I've become conscious of through one of my videos. It's just the tip of the iceberg. My video is explicating something that's implicit and much larger, sort of like the iceberg under the water effect. You only see the tip. The tip is the explicit part. The rest of the iceberg is the implicit part. Most of reality is implicit. The problem is that when you expect me to explicate all of it for you, that itself is the mistake. That's the core mistake that science makes, is that it approaches the study of reality with the assumption that all of it can be explicated, and if it can't be explicated, it isn't true. That turns out to be a dogma of science. That turns out to be false. And it turns out to be one of the fundamental limitations of science, because you can keep doing science for 1 billion years and you can keep describing and measuring and explicating reality, and you will not be any closer to the end of it. And that's fine. You can do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But the mistake is not getting that that's what you're doing. You see, science would be a lot better off if science understood that what it's doing is that it's explicating the implicit, and that it will never, ever complete that process. And how do we know that? Through implicit understanding. You see, a scientist will say, oh, Leo, but you don't really know that. Prove it. But you see, when you take that stance, that is the very problem that I'm talking about. This is a meta problem. This is an epistemological problem. It's, in a sense, it's more fundamental than science. It's meta-scientific, a meta-scientific problem. A problem that can't be solved within science is that you have to go outside of science, prior to science, to be able to understand the limitations of science and the limitations of your demand that all of reality can be explicated. It can't. Let's give you some more examples. Let's give you some more common ones, not such nerdy ones. Like, for example, the punchline of a joke. You spoil a joke when you over-explain it. What makes a joke is that there's something implicit there, the punchline, that your mind in one instant groks. And it's like, oh yeah, that, and then it's funny. There's a sort of a reversal, a twist that happens within the punchline of a joke that makes the situation funny. And Imagine if you were a type of person that was so serious about life that when somebody told you a joke, you were so literal about it, about interpreting it, you weren't intuitive at all. You weren't willing to go into the implicit at all. You were just completely explicit. That you didn't get it. You never got what a joke is. You never laughed at any joke in life because you just hear the jokes very strictly, and then you ask the person to explain it to you, and by the time they explain it to you, it's no longer funny. You ever had that happen to you? I think I should tell a joke, I guess, at this point to demonstrate this. What's a joke that I know? Okay, there's a funny one, a little interesting one. So Sherlock Holmes and Watson, his companion, they went to the desert camping, and they set up a tent, and they lay there in the tent, and then they go to sleep, and then in the middle of the night, they go to sleep looking up at the sky, and then they go into their tent and they go to sleep. And then so in the middle of the night, Sherlock Holmes wakes up Watson, and he says, "Watson, look up and tell me what you see. Tell me what you deduce." And so Watson looks up at the night sky, and he looks at the stars, and he says, "Wow, there's so many stars up there. It looks like there's thousands of them, millions, maybe even billions. And can you imagine, Holmes, if only 1% of those stars had planets, and only 1% of those planets had life, how many different life forms and aliens and creatures must be out there in the universe that we haven't even contacted yet? So Holmes, what I deduce is that the universe must be teeming with life." And Sherlock Holmes tells him, "No, you idiot. Somebody stole our tent." Ta-da! You get it? So see, there's something implicit in the punchline. There's something unspoken. That's what makes it funny. And if you need it to be described to you, then you don't get it. And that's sort of the problem that's happening with science, is that science is so fixated on everything being turned literal and explicit that it misses the punchline of life, the punchline of reality. And mysticism is really sort of the antidote to that. Mysticism is the exploration of the implicit aspects of reality, which science neglects because it's only focused on the explicit. Another example for you is flirtation and subcommunication. Flirtation is implicit if it's done right. And if you take flirtation and you make it explicit, you ruin it. And a lot of men who first start to learn how to flirt with women, and I had to go through this process because I was really bad at flirtation because I was so explicit. That I had no subtlety. I didn't understand the subtle art of flirtation. I had to learn that. I had to sort of like rewire how my brain thinks in order to think in an implicit way to be able to flirt with women and to attract them. See, but a lot of like very nerdy autistic guys, they don't know how to flirt. And there's a really good example that I'm going to steal here from Slavoj Žižek, who's a philosopher, postmodernist philosopher. And it's his example about coffee and flirtation. So some movie, I forget which movie, he stole it from some movie. So there's a guy and a girl, they have their date, they come back to the outside of the girl's house. And so, the girl is trying to, figure out how to get the guy. And so she says, "Oh, would you like to come upstairs for a coffee?" And the guy says, "Oh, I don't drink coffee." And she says, "Oh, that's okay, I don't have any." See, that's flirtation. That's Something is being communicated, but it's not being explicitly stated. And that's exactly what you need for successful romance to take place. Now, imagine if the guy was autistic and he needed everything to be fully explicated to him. And so the girl said that, and he said, oh, so you mean we're going to come upstairs and fuck? Is that what you mean? Because you don't have coffee. That means we're going to fuck, right? So if he said that, that's it. The girl would never fuck him. He ruined it. See, but he has to be clever and wise enough, intuitive enough to understand that we have to keep it subtle. You can't just explicitly tell a girl that we're going to go fuck. It's not going to work. But the way scientists approach life and reality is they're like that autistic guy where when the girl is like, hey, come upstairs for a coffee. And the guy's like, oh, so you mean I'm going to insert my penis into your vagina? Oh, please tell me more. Here, let me take out my clipboard and let's write out all the things we're going to do. How many times do you want me to insert my penis into your vagina? Is it going to be 20 times, 30 times? And then are we going to do some more stuff? Like, is there going to be cunnilingus involved? Is there going to be oral sex? And what kind? Please describe it all to me. This is what science is doing with reality. But by the time you end up doing that, that is, you see, that very process of approaching reality and life that way, in that explicit way, something is lost in that process. But many of these scientifically minded types who are very against mysticism, just as a dogma, they're against it. They don't get what they're missing. So the point of this communication is to help you to see what we're missing. So in this communication, what I'm doing is notice what I'm doing is I'm giving you examples similar to what we did with the natural numbers, like the example 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So as I'm giving you more of these examples, I'm hoping that at some point it gets through to you and it penetrates into your skull and you have an epiphany where you realize like, oh, I've been approaching my entire life in this very limited, explicit fashion, and there's all these other aspects of life that are implicit I have been missing out on. That's what I'm hoping you get. So by explicating this, I'm hoping you're going to grasp something implicit by the end of this episode. Will that happen? Depends on you. Depends on how intuitive you are. Depends on how holistically you're able to think about the things that I say here. So if you haven't gotten it yet, let's keep going. I got more examples for you. So just to touch a little bit more upon the flirtation business. When you're trying to attract women as a man, the most important thing for attracting women is the subcommunication, getting your subcommunication correct. What is subcommunication? It's all the stuff that you don't say, which is actually doing the speaking for you when you're speaking to a woman and you're trying to attract her. So for example, most guys, if you tell just like a total newbie, hey, go approach that girl and try to attract her and flirt with her, he'll immediately get in his head and he'll be confused and he'll be wondering like, okay, well, what should I say? What are the perfect lines that I need to tell her to get her to fall in love with me? But see, that's thinking about it all wrong. That's thinking about it explicitly. There is no particular line that will get a girl to fall in love with you. Rather, the way you attract her is in the way you approach and in the way you present yourself. It's actually the subtle cues that you don't even know you're doing. It's at the subconscious level. It's your eye contact. It's your tone of voice. It's how you square up with her. It's how you present yourself. It's how confident you are. It's how easy you are about yourself. It's how fearless you are. Because if you come up to her and you're mumbly and you're stumbly and you're scared and you're shy and you're meek and you try to supplicate to her, you can't keep eye contact with her, and you're worried about what kind of lines to say, and maybe you have a memorized line that you think is cool and you're going to say that and you're going to try to impress her with your coolness. If you do it that way, you're guaranteed to fail. Not because you said the wrong words, but because of the way in which you subcommunicated yourself, you see, because she is reading your subcommunications for honest signals of your masculine energy. She doesn't care about the words you use, because words are easy to fake. She knows that you can memorize some line and you can use that line on 1,000 girls. That's easy to fake. But what you can't fake is being a genuinely expressive, authentic, masculine man with that kind of nice, confident energy and a laid back sense of humor and authenticity and bravado and confidence. That's something that's very difficult to fake. And so what a lot of people don't understand about how attraction works is that the whole way that you get good at attraction as a man is that you don't try to find some trick to get in the woman's pants. No, you actually change yourself as a man to become that kind of person who can exude the authentic, honest signals that she will later pick up on and will attract her. And that's genuine attraction rather than some sort of fakery. See? And of course, the woman is doing all of this without any awareness that she's doing it. It's all happening automatic on her end. So many women don't even understand that this is happening. They just have an intuition. And women are extremely intuitive. And one of the reasons women are so intuitive is because over thousands of years of men trying to trick them into bed, women have had to learn how to suss out the real men from the fakers. See? Women are more implicit by their nature. Their mind works in a more implicit manner than a man's mind. A man's mind is more autistic and it wants everything explicated. And that's a lot of times why men get frustrated by women in relationships, for example. You ever get frustrated if you're a man with a woman where it's like the woman has some sort of problem, she's crying or she's upset or whatever, and you're trying to comfort her. And if you were comforting a man, you could just ask your man friend, just like, okay, what's the deal? Let's work through your problem, brainstorm some solutions, and then I'll give you some advice, and then we'll just move on. Everything will be fine. But you can't do that with a woman. With a woman, you have to read between the lines. You have to kind of like intuitively guess what's going on, and then she'll tell you, oh, nothing is wrong. She might be crying, but she'll say, oh, nothing is wrong. Or she might be angry, but she'll say, oh, I'm not really angry. There's no problem. And then if you're a dumb guy, you'll say, oh, okay, yeah, so there's no problem. Well, Leo, she said there's no problem, so there's no problem, right? Wrong. She said there's no problem. That means there is a problem. It's exactly the opposite. Now, as a man, we think like, well, why can't she just be fucking straightforward with us? If there's a problem, why can't she just say there's a problem? Why does she have to deny it and play these games? Because she's operating from a different paradigm. She's operating from an implicit paradigm. So if you want to get good with women as a man, you have to learn to tune into that different paradigm. And then things will go well for you. And if you try to be overly explicit with women in all these situations, then you're going to find yourself rejected and heartbroken as they leave you until you learn your lesson. And that's a large part of what learning how to be good with women is for a guy, is learning how to think differently. See, men like to get everything spelled out literally, whereas women like to be a lot more intuitive. Another example of the implicit is in movies. In a really good movie, they show you things rather than just telling you things. So if you're a good writer, you will write a scene where something is shown to the audience without being explicitly stated. For example, you could have a movie scene, if it's written by an amateur writer. It'll be two guys, they're in a room, and it's just a exposition dump of dialogue. One guy will tell the other guy, I am angry at you because you did XYZ to me. Something like that. That's not nearly as masterful as showing it without saying it. So if you're a good writer, you have to kind of think backwards, and you have to think about like, okay, how can I show the audience that guy A is pissed off at guy B for reasons X, Y, Z, but not say any of that in the scene? So it'll be through a look. It'll be through what he's doing. I'll set up the scene in such a way where maybe he's acting passive aggressive, or guy B has like a favorite object of his, and guy A who's pissed off, he steals it and breaks it or something, and that is what communicates to you that guy A is pissed off at guy B. So explicit is not always better. And then for those of you nerds who are really, scientifically minded and rationally minded, there's the example from logic. I talked about this in a lot of length in my episode called The Metaphysical Implications of Gödel's Incompleteness Theorem, where Kurt Gödel basically discovered and proved that all logics are inherently limited, in that there's always stuff that's true within a logical system that cannot be proven or demonstrated by the logical system itself. There are sort of meta-truths that require a meta-logic to the first-order logic. There's a second-order logic that needs to be added on top of it in order to explain all the truths at the first-order logic level. But then there's other truths at the second-order logic level which can't be described by second-order logic. You need a third level of third-order logic. And then there's additional truths at the third level now that are created which can't be described by the third level. There needs to be a fourth level, and so on to infinity. That's what basically Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows. There are always truths which are outside of any logical symbolic system, which cannot be proven. And Kurt Gödel proved that. See? And so there's an infinite number of orders of logic, and an infinite number of different types of logic, contrary to what many scientifically and rationally minded people like to think. See? So actually, logic itself is transcendental, and truth transcends logic. You can create a million different orders of levels of logic, and you will still not be able to capture all of truth within your logic. It's impossible. What Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows is that if your logic is complete, it necessarily contradicts itself. And if your logic is incomplete, or rather, if your logic doesn't contradict itself, then it's necessarily incomplete. That's a twisted, strange, loopy conclusion, which is the consequence of the fact that truth cannot be encapsulated in any kind of symbolic system. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment here, about why that is. Here's another example of the implicit. Let's say you're getting into meditation, and you learn that the monkey mind is the enemy in your life, and you want to silence the monkey mind. And so basically what that means is you want to stop thinking. So you sit down, you try to meditate, you center yourself, and then you start to say to yourself, okay, I'm thinking all the time, and now I want to stop thinking. Let me stop thinking. Ah, I've done it. I've stopped thinking. Oh no, that's a thought. Oh, that's another thought. Oh no, that's another thought. Wait a minute. Okay, I got to stop thinking. Let me stop thinking. Okay, hold on. 3 seconds from now, I'm going to stop thinking. 1, 2, 3. I did it. Oh no, that's a thought. You see what's going on here? You can't use the mind to stop thinking. But of course, it takes a lot of practice for the mind to be able to grok that. Because the mind, every time it stops thinking, it wants to think some more. It wants to think about how it stopped thinking, which is just more thinking, which is sort of the self-defeating process. So what needs to happen through meditation is that you need to implicitly grasp some sort of new approach, which is a non-thinking approach to life. And it's hard to grasp that because that can't be done with the thinking mind. See, it can't be done explicitly. There's no explicit like formula you can follow to stop thinking. And you need to grasp that. And the mind is resistant to grasping that because it's stuck on thinking. Here's another cool example. This is an example of reading between the lines. And I like this phrase, reading between the lines, because this is something that I want to really teach to you as a life lesson. But first, let me present it to you with just this specific one example. Notice the following. If you're a writer, no matter how much you write, it will always be possible to read between the lines of what you've written. For example, Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote a bunch of stuff. And we can go back and read Shakespeare's work, and we can wonder, well, he wrote these lines. These are the explicit lines of what he wrote. But what did he really mean by those lines? Did he mean A, B, or C? Which did he mean? Now you might say, well, wouldn't it be easier if Shakespeare just wrote exactly what he meant? Because it seems like Shakespeare was kind of ambiguous in certain places. Writers generally are ambiguous. Sometimes they write sentences which are ambiguous. You don't know if the writer's trying to say A, B, or C, or something else. So how do we know which way to interpret them? And you might say, wouldn't it be nice if the writer just, was extremely explicit all the time and just literally wrote everything he thought? And you would say, well, that would work, right? But it wouldn't. Because it's always possible to read between the lines of what was written. How would you know that the writer was fully explicit? You might say, well, the writer could write. At the end of his book, he could say, okay, in this book, I have written everything that I wanted to write. And everything in this book is completely explicit and exactly the way it is, and it should be read completely literally. The end. But you can always wonder, well, is he being genuine about saying that? Or is he playing coy? Is he serious? Or is he joking? Is he playing some kind of trick on me? Is he being honest or dishonest? Is he fooling himself? So you could always wonder these things. Which sort of leads us to the paradox of honesty. If you're wondering whether somebody is honest, you can't determine that by asking them to explicitly tell you whether they're honest or not. So let's say that I'm a dishonest, lying thief, and you're doing business with me, and I'm a con artist also. And so you're worried that I might con you and lie to you and bilk you out of your hard-earned money. And you ask me, Leo, are you honest? Are you going to steal my money from me? What'll I tell you? Of course not. I would never lie to you. I'm the most honest person in the world. I'm not a con artist. I would never steal money from you. You can totally trust me. Let's go into business together. It'll be great. Are you going to trust me? See, it does no good to ask me whether I'm honest or not if I'm dishonest. To determine whether I'm honest, that's a meta. That's an implicit meta thing that's outside of the scope of our conversation. You can't really encode that into the first order level of our conversation because honesty is about that. It's a meta issue. You see, you can't make it explicit. It's an implicit thing, which goes back to the point about flirtation with women. The reason women have to listen to your subcommunication rather than to your first order communication, to your words, is because it's very easy for a man to just lie to a woman with words. It's easy for a man to come up to a woman and say, oh, I'm a millionaire, I have a fast car, and I'm awesome, and I'll be a great husband and all this. You can tell her all that, but can she trust you? No, She can't trust you because she knows that you want to get her into her pants at any cost. So you're going to lie. So what she has to do is she has to go meta or read your subcommunication to make sure that the guy isn't trying to bullshit her. See? She's looking for honest signals, the stuff that's difficult to fake. Words are very easy to fake. This is not a bug of reality. This is a feature of reality. This is not a bad thing. This is actually how reality works at a deep metaphysical epistemic level. That's what I'm trying to show to you. And this notion of reading between the lines is extremely important in this work that we're doing. You can't just approach reality in this dumb, explicit manner where you only read the lines and nothing between the lines. A lot of religious people suffer from this problem because they read a Bible or some sort of holy text, or they listen to some words from some guru, and they take them so literally that there's no room for interpretation in their mind. But the whole trick to all spiritual writings and teachings is that they're always talking about something transcendent and implicit which can never be spoken. So if you try to approach spiritual texts with this explicit mentality, you're always going to get it wrong. Because the true heart of what spirituality is trying to point you towards, mysticism is trying to point you towards, is the implicit and the transcendent. That which cannot be put into words. That which can only be sort of pointed to vaguely. And then it's your job to realize the finger is pointing at the moon. So basically what I'm trying to tell you here is that to a certain degree, all understanding is implicit. There's different degrees of understanding and implicitness or explicitness to understanding. You can't make someone understand something that they don't understand. That might seem like a tautology and it might seem like a vacuous statement, but actually it's a very profound statement. To get somebody to understand somebody, to get somebody to understand something, you have to explicate more and more of that thing until eventually you're hoping that they grok it intuitively. And if they lack that intuitive grokking ability, no amount of explication will be enough for them to get it. There is no substitute for understanding or for grokking. Even within mathematics, you might say, well, Leo, it's obvious that 1 + 1 = 2, and everybody can get it. No. The whole point is that it's not obvious that 1 + 1 = 2. It's obvious to you because you take it for granted. But at some point in your life, it wasn't obvious that 1 + 1 = 2. That was something you had to understand. And that was a leap in consciousness that happened. See? And if you were incapable of making that intuitive leap of consciousness, you would not know that 1 + 1 = 2. If you try to tell a donkey that 1 + 1 = 2, the donkey won't get it. You might say, well, that's because the donkey doesn't understand English. That's not why. I mean, of course, the donkey does not understand English. That is, of course, a problem. But that's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that the donkey can't grok it. And in fact, all mathematical proof hinges on personal intuitive understanding. So the irony about mathematics is that people who proclaim mathematics as the ultimate absolute truth and, the most scientific of things, the most objective and indisputable of things, the irony of that position is that what these people don't understand is that there can be no mathematics without personal, direct, intuitive understanding. A mathematical proof cannot work without that. In the same way that I've said before, if you take a donkey and you show him his reflection in the mirror and you try to point and you try to like get the donkey to recognize his own face in the mirror, it's not going to work. The donkey is incapable of it. Not because the donkey is stupid per se, but because there isn't that intuitive leap. In a sense, for a donkey to be able to recognize his own face in the mirror, a mystical insight needs to occur, which us humans take for granted. See, when you get up in the morning and you go brush your teeth and you look in the mirror every morning at your own face and you recognize that as being you, you don't think of that recognition of yourself in the mirror as being a mystical experience. You think of it as just like, it's obvious, it's just an objective scientific fact. There I am. But there's nothing objective or scientific about that fact. That's a mystical understanding. It's just so commonplace, and you share it amongst everybody else in your tribe so much, in your culture, that you just take it for granted and you've called this science or objective. But there's a mysterious understanding. How do you actually know that that thing in the mirror is actually you? Some kind of recognition had to take place there. That was intuition at work. You certainly didn't go through some sort of proof process. It's not like you sat down one day looking at a mirror and you said, okay, here's a freckle on this cheek and there's a freckle on that cheek. And here's a nose and there's a nose. And here's a lip and there's a lip. And here's a tooth and there's a tooth. And there's a hair here and a hair there. Oh, that's me. I proved it. You didn't go through that process. You grasped it intuitively, instantly at one point in your life. And most creatures on this planet can't do that. A few can. Supposedly crows can do it. Certain chimps and monkeys can do it. Apes, I think. Maybe a few more animals can do it. I think like ravens can do it or something. And that's about it. Maybe dolphins, I don't know. And so this takes us to the issue of God now, of course. So why is there all this confusion about God? How do you come up with a proof for God? You can't come up with a proof for God because God is implicit. God is everything. So how do you prove God? You can't. The only way you can understand what God is to realize that you are God. Do you understand that right now, that you are God? Are you conscious of that? No, you're like that donkey in that mirror. You don't get it. And so, I mean, I could help to kind of explicate more and more of God to you, but at some point, no matter how much I explicate, at some point you got to grok it or you won't get it. And you will just sit there and deny that there's a God. See? You just don't get it. And there's no substitute for getting it other than getting it. You have to get it. You can't make someone understand something they don't understand. There's no substitute or shortcut for understanding. Understanding is it. You either get it or you don't. Of course, it can be helpful to explicate God in the same way that it can be helpful when we're dealing with a child to explicate the natural numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until the child gets it. So if we took, for example, a group of 100 children who are, I don't know, let's say 5 years old or something like that. Children who basically didn't know numbers. We took 100 of them and then we sat them all down and we just did a science experiment where we took a big whiteboard and we started writing out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we told the children as we're doing this, we told them, raise your hand at the moment that you understand that numbers are infinite and endless. So a few children, a very small percent of children, would raise their hand immediately because they already get it. But most of them wouldn't. So you'd have to explicate. So you'd have to say, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the time you got to 5, a few more children would raise their hand because they would get it that it's good. This is going to keep going forever. But many children still wouldn't get it. They're a little bit slow, not as intuitive as the other ones. So we got to keep going. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. A few more would raise their hand. By the time we got to maybe 50, the number 50, the majority of them would raise their hand, but a few still wouldn't. They're lagging behind. So we would keep doing this until we hope that they would all get it at some point. But some of them wouldn't get it even if we went to 1 million. So that person is a lost cause. That's a problem with their intuition. So it's exactly the same way with God. If you're trying to become conscious of what God is, except it's a little more tricky with God because it's so devilishly tricky and twisted that we explicate more and more of God to you through various spiritual teachings and through meditation exercises and so forth, guided meditations and so on, and through self-inquiry practice and so on. You keep doing that through psychedelics as well. You can keep explicating more and more and more of God until one day it becomes so fucking obvious that you're like, oh, all of this is God. Oh, okay, I get it now. Duh, of course. But it took years and years, sometimes decades of explication for you to get to that point. See? And every person will wake up at their own pace. Some people need a few days. Some people need a few years. Some people need a few decades. Some people need a few lifetimes to wake up. Here's another example for you of implicit versus explicit. I was at a workshop a while back with Peter Ralston. He was teaching this workshop, and I'll never forget this. We were talking about language, the nature of language. Language is a very interesting thing to contemplate. And anyways, he was explaining basically how all symbols are sort of relative and meaningless. We project meaning onto symbols. That's all nice and fairly easy to understand. But there was a moment where my jaw dropped in my understanding of how symbols work and how language works. And that's when I understood that the act of pointing at a thing with your finger, that itself is a meaningless act that we are projecting meaning onto. So you might say, like, how does a child know what the word cat means? Well, you would say probably something like the parents say the word cat, and then they take their finger and they point at a cat, that thing over, that furry tailed thing over there. They point at it, they say cat, 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 and the child goes, oh yeah, okay, so cat is that thing that the parent is pointing at. And that's, first of all, recognize that's a pretty big leap in consciousness to be able to recognize that, oh, the word cat is somehow connected to that furry thing over there. That's a pretty amazing thing the human consciousness is able to do. But there's something even more amazing here. What's even more amazing is that the human consciousness is able to understand that this thing here, this act of pointing, that this has a meaning to it beyond what it actually is, more than just a finger. Because if you go to a donkey and you point to a donkey, hey, look back there, and you point this way, the donkey is not going to look at your, where you're pointing. The donkey is just going to look at your finger and see a finger. He's not going to see a pointer. So just to understand that a finger is a pointer is already a momentous leap in consciousness. That's a highly implicit and intuitive activity. So it's not just that the child is connecting the sound cat to a furry creature over there. It's that the child is first understanding the meaning of this pointing activity and that there is even such a possibility as pointing at all. When I realized that, that's when my jaw dropped. That's a mind fuck right there. When you understand the significance of that. that a pointer is something that your mind is projecting onto reality. There's really no such thing as pointers until you imagine that there are. A finger is not really a pointer. Wow, that's deep. So reality is transcendental. What does that mean? Sounds like a fancy philosophical word. Sounds like it's just a word salad, doesn't mean anything. Well, no, it means something. Here's a definition for transcendental, again, gathered from various online dictionaries. Quote, surpassing or superior, mystical, supernatural, metaphysical, abstruse, which means difficult to understand or obscure, and abstract, a function that cannot be expressed by a finite number of algebraic operations, not expressible algebraically in terms of variables and constants, idealist, lofty, categories that have universal applications such as being, oneness, truth, and goodness. Extremely special and unusual and cannot be understood in ordinary ways. Beyond the human experience. Things that lie beyond the practical experience of ordinary people and cannot be discovered or understood by ordinary reasoning. Extra categorical attributes of being. That's transcendental. So basically, what transcendental means is that no matter how much you explicate reality, there will always be more left over, which is implicit and unexplicated. And that is, in a sense, the very essence of reality itself. Reality is a thing which is endlessly being explicated without ever ending. Reality is like a bag of marbles, and you can pull out one marble, 2 marbles, 3 marbles, 4 marbles, and you can keep pulling out these marbles forever, and they never end. And you might wonder, that's impossible. That's crazy. How could that be? This breaks the laws of logic and science and physics and all this. No, it doesn't break the laws of anything. If you look around you carefully, you'll see that this process of infinity being explicated, from going from the implicit to the explicit, is happening all the time in all places, whether it's a coffee cup or it's the natural numbers that you learned in grade school, or it's anything. And literally any object around you is infinite, can be explicated forever. I guess it would be more accurate to say that reality is like a bag out of which we can just pull objects of any kind. We can pull out a marble, we can pull out a fish, we can pull out a cat, a dog, a building, a car, a tree, sex, male, female, a planet, a galaxy, a universe, a star, a meteor, a dinosaur, a human, and we can just keep going and going, and it's an endless bag of anything you want. That's basically what infinity is. Now, okay, be careful though to distinguish when I talk about infinity, there's sort of 2 infinities. The infinity I was talking about at the very beginning, the numerical infinity of the natural numbers, that's infinity with a lowercase I. So just, it's the infinity of numbers. And then when I'm talking about infinity of the entire universe, I'm talking about absolute infinity. That's the nature of what God is. It's absolute infinity. That's the nature of what everything is, absolute infinity. That's not a numerical thing. Don't confuse that with numerical infinity. Absolute infinity is actual infinity. Actual infinity is what is happening right here, right now. It's everything. It's all the physical stuff that you see. That's actual infinity. So be careful to distinguish those two and not blur them together. Numerical infinity is just one infinity within absolute infinity. See, absolute infinity contains an infinite number of lower infinities. So I want you to take seriously the possibility that the deepest truths and understandings in life are necessarily irreducibly implicit, requiring intuition and consciousness that can't be replaced or substituted with anything else, cannot be fully articulated, cannot be broken down into a linear sequence of steps, cannot be formally proven, and that none of this is a weakness, that this is actually a strength. Because this is what allows reality to be endless. If it wasn't this way, reality would be finite, and we would quickly get to the end of it. And it would be rather boring and kind of bland, because we would know everything. The amazing thing about reality is that it's endless. You can never know it. You can keep trying to know it forever, and that process will never end. But at the same time, even though that's true, you can also grasp the fact that it's unknowable, or that it's infinite, absolutely infinite, as a whole, in the same way that you can with the natural numbers. So don't make the mistake of thinking like, well, if reality is infinite, that means that we can't really know that, it's impossible to know that, and therefore we're screwed. No. That's not what it means. That would be the same mistake as a child seeing me writing on a whiteboard, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the child would say, oh, well, we're screwed now because obviously, we're not going to sit here forever and count up all these numbers. No, you can actually understand that this goes on forever, and that is the nature of numbers, is that they go on forever. You can know that without explicitly knowing what the trillionth number is. See? And that's an amazing thing that your mind is able to do. Your mind is able to holistically understand a thing without having to explicate in a linear sequence all of its finite steps. But if you keep insisting that we have to explicate everything, now there you're screwed. But in that case, you're screwing yourself, which is what I want you to recognize. You're artificially limiting your own self, your own mind. Your mind is capable of going infinite if you let it. But if you demonize the infinite, and if you demonize paradox, and if you demonize and diminish the implicit, and you deny that it exists, well, then you've limited yourself to being limited. See? So you have to be careful about how your own mind limits you in this situation. So why is it that truth, with a capital T, the ultimate truth, why can't it be explicated? Because of oneness. Because everything is one, that means knowing and being are necessarily entangled. Because the explicit comes out of the implicit, and they're entangled. The truth cannot be explicated for the same reason that a hand cannot grasp itself. Because it is itself. Explication is a subset of truth. For explication to occur, truth needs to be there first. See? Truth is not limited to explication, but explication is limited to truth. Because for a thing to be, it has to be true. For explication to be, it has to be true. It has to exist. For my words to be able to describe reality, first they have to be real, then they could, or could not, faithfully represent reality. Both are possible. Words can lie, or they can be more honest. But either way, they have to exist. See? This means words are second order. They're not first order. Truth is first order. Which is why you can't explicate all of truth. Because truth is infinite. And your words, your thoughts, pictures, symbols, whatever you want to use to do your explication, all of that is finite. Explication, articulation, explanation, communication, proof, these are always indirect. It's a type of translation, and something is always lost in translation. That's what I want you to understand here. It's a handicap to go through life expecting all of it to be explicated. This is one of the handicaps of science that science is going to have to overcome to transcend in order to really deeply start to explore reality. This is going to be a synthesis of science. There's going to be a coming together in the future of science and mysticism, because the two were never really at odds. Science does some great stuff with its explication work, and mysticism does some great stuff with its penetrating into the implicit aspects of reality. And both are two sides of the coin that really need to work together in tandem. When they're too separated from each other and the two sides don't talk to each other because they both hate each other or they both think the other is wrong, that's when you get a dysfunctional system like we have right now. See? There's value to both, the implicit and the explicit. It's just a matter of getting the balance correct and not denying one in favor of the other. Here's a list of examples of things that cannot be explicated. Truth, the absolute, consciousness, and God. All of those are the same thing. You can't ever explicate those. That is the ultimate nature of reality. Non-duality. Awakening, enlightenment. This cannot be explicated. Love. Intuition, a gut feeling, a hunch. Have you ever had a gut feeling that something is wrong about a situation, but you can't quite put your finger on it? If I ask you to articulate and describe why you think this is a bad situation, you shouldn't enter into the situation, you can't say what it is. You just know you shouldn't enter that situation. You shouldn't go into that building. You shouldn't enter this marriage. You shouldn't be hanging around this person. And sure enough, a year later, you discover that, that building collapsed. This person got killed in a car accident, and this marriage would have been terrible for you or whatever. But if a scientist asks you, well, where's your proof? Where's your proof that you knew this? You ain't going to get proof. This is something that's deeper than proof can reach. Other things that cannot be explicated: a sunset, an orgasm, a vision, a psychedelic trip, a mystical experience, the paranormal, and extrasensory perception, ESP. Insight. The reason behind creation, all of creation. Yeah, there's a reason to it. And you might wonder, well, what's the reason, Leo? Well, I can't explicate it to you. It's implicit. You'll only get it when you get it. There's no point in me trying to tell it to you. You ain't going to get it. Can't be put into words. Reading people's emotions and intentions. That's implicit stuff. Your life as a whole is really implicit. You can't explain your life to anybody. What it's like to be you and to live as you, this is something that is unique to you. Only you know what it's like to live in your shoes and to experience life in the way that you experience life. Only you have that unique experience. And no matter how many biographies you write or whatever, you're never going to be able to explain to anybody what it was like to live as you. The only way other people can know what it's like to live as you is actually to live through your life by being you, literally. That's the only way. Everything else is a poor translation. Zen is another good example of the implicit. Zen koans, the way that Zen masters teach. When you first start learning Zen from a Western perspective, especially if you're kind of scientifically minded the way that I was when I started learning Zen, reading about it. This was maybe 10 years ago. I started reading my first books on Zen. And one of the biggest things that baffled me was like, why do these Zen masters speak in riddles? Why can't they just be straightforward and tell me what the fuck they're trying to say? Why do they got to beat around the bush with their stories about birds and frogs and fish and this and that and monks doing mysterious things? Just tell me what the fuck you want to tell me, and I'll know it. But of course they can't, because the whole point of Zen is that they're trying to point you towards the absolute, which is inexplicable by its very nature. You can't explicate enlightenment, which is why Zen masters speak in riddles. It would be helpful for you if you're trying to learn Zen or you're pursuing spirituality to realize that. You know, I see people often on the forum, for example, on the Actualized forum, they will, post endless questions about God, about enlightenment, about awakening, about this, about spirituality, question after question after question, just like a verbal diarrhea of questions. But at some point, the student in this process needs to understand that your questions can be forever. Your questions turn into a distraction. Because when you're asking a question, that assumes that you can just get an answer, and then you're going to read that answer, you're going to believe that answer, and it's like, oh, okay, now I got it. But you don't got it. If you think you got it, you don't got it when it comes to this work. You got to actually contemplate and go for that intuition. The answer needs to come from inside of you, not from my words. Which again creates one of the biggest traps of all of the work with Actualize.org. The biggest trap is that you're going to listen to all the things I say, you're going to take it all literally, and you're going to think you're going to think that you understand what I said, but actually all you have are just beliefs and ideas, just mental masturbation and armchair philosophy, and you haven't actually done any of the work to become directly conscious of the things that I speak about. And that's going to be very problematic for you. It's going to create suffering for you. It's going to screw up your whole life. So watch out. Be careful of that trap. So finally, in conclusion, you might wonder, well, Leo, so what? How is any of this practical? Here are the practical takeaways of what you should do about the things you learned in this episode. First of all, acknowledge that reality is implicit. Acknowledge that the implicit is as real as the explicit. Secondly, stop expecting and demanding everything to be explicated to you. Thirdly, learn to be silent and to appreciate the wisdom of silence. It's in the silence that you get your deepest answers. It's through the silence that you reach the implicit, not through constant talking and debating and yabbering and jabbering and opinionizing and all of this. Fourthly, start to rely more on your intuition. This is a huge, huge component of becoming a highly advanced human being, is really working on trusting your intuition, listening to your intuition, feeling it, honoring it. Because one of the biggest challenges with your intuition, following your intuition, it's not that you have to silence yourself enough to even hear it, which is the first problem. Most people are so distracted by watching TV and their smartphone and all this crap that they don't even hear their intuition. Another big part of the population doesn't even believe that intuition is a thing. Or if they do, then to them, intuition is just some sort of, woo-woo, airy-fairy thing that shouldn't be taken seriously because science is what's real. And intuition is just some new age nonsense. So you've got to overcome that. But even after you overcome those two hurdles, there's going to be the biggest hurdle is that once your intuition starts talking to you and you start listening to it, it's going to tell you some scary stuff. It's going to tell you things about how you have to change your life in ways that you don't want to change. It's going to be a threat to your ego, which is precisely why you're drowning it out all the time with video games and other crap. Because your intuition is guiding you towards truth, towards love, towards consciousness, towards God. But this is not easy. This is difficult work. It's almost like learning to use the Force from Star Wars. Could you imagine the absurdity of a scientist in the Star Wars universe flying to Yoda's planet, Dagobah, in The Empire Strikes Back, flying to his planet in the swamp, and the scientists and a team of scientists, with their notepads and their lab coats, white lab coats, they go to Yoda's hut, they locate it, then they get their tape measures, they start measuring the diameter of Yoda's hut, and then they start measuring the diameter of Yoda's ears and how long they are and the hairs and everything. They treat him like a lab animal, and then they start asking him questions, and they're like, okay, so tell us about this force that you know about, this spooky force. What is this force? Like, can you quantify it for us? Can you explicate it for? Tell me, how does this force work? What does it do? Where does it come from? And where's it going? Where did it come from? And why? And how? And this? And what kind of experiments can we run on it? This is not how the force works. At that point, he would just force choke that scientist. You see? That's not how you approach learning the force. It's a different paradigm. It's more heart-centered, more intuitive, more holistic. The problem is that our culture has demonized this and has called it woo-woo, airy-fairy stuff, subjective stuff, stuff that your mind is making up, stuff that you're imagining. It's demonized it with these sorts of labels, and that's a great shame. And so what we're doing in this episode is we're trying to reverse that, that misconception that culture has fed to you about the nature of the intuitive and the implicit and the transcendental. Another takeaway here for you that's practical is stop trying to explain or to justify your highest visions and motivations and intuitions to others. If you have a vision for your life that you feel in your heart is something you got to follow, something that's important, if you feel that it's important for you to seek the truth or to follow some life purpose or to go into some career, to be an artist, to be a musician, to be a teacher or a doctor or whatever, if you feel this, if you have a vision for mankind, it's your job to honor that and not to justify it or to explain it to others. Because there will be many naysayers. Your parents will say, you want to pursue the truth, huh? Well, how are you going to pay for your food? Who's going to pay for your rent? That's how parents often think about such things. It's like, you want to become a musician, huh? So like, why don't you become a lawyer instead? That'll earn you more money. But you gotta trust your own vision, and a vision is an intuitive thing. It's a very personal thing. Only you can know whether your vision is appropriate for you and whether your vision is going to be appropriate for the people around you and for mankind as a whole. If you start to approach visions for your life in some sort of scientific, autistic manner where it's like, let me prove whether this vision is good or not, you've already screwed up. Visions are like the Force. You got to learn to trust and cultivate your visions, to make your visions stronger and more powerful until you're able to use those visions and then enforce them. For the vision is really something implicit that's coming out and then into the explicit. Some more practical things. Allow your understanding of things and situations to be intuitive and abstract. Really get good at thinking in abstract ways. This topic of abstraction is so important that actually there's an entire separate episode, long episode I'll have about that. Get good at reading between the lines. Remember that example that I gave you. There are many situations in life where you need to read between the lines. In attracting a mate, in a relationship, in a marriage, with your children, with your students, if you're a teacher, reading between the lines with your health. If you're feeling something in your body, read between the lines there. When you're reading spiritual texts, when you're listening to spiritual teachings, when you're in business, you can read between the lines of things. Read between the lines of the data that's being presented to you. That's what makes you a great business leader. Read between the lines of people's words, what they tell you, and so forth. Read between the lines of the things that I tell you of my work. There's a lot in my work that lies between the lines of what I say. That which goes unspoken. Also, practically speaking, understand that others read between the lines of what you say and do. It's possible to read you like a book. Even better than a book. Just by watching your face, your emotions, your body posture, your language, all this sort of stuff. And you can get good at that. Other people can get good at that too. This is a valuable skill. It's an art form. Also, practically understand that there will be always gaps in communication and things will always be lost in translation. Take that into account. Especially when you're listening to deep teachings. After you finish watching one of my episodes, you could always ask yourself, okay, so that's what Leo actually said, but what are the things he didn't say that are important in this episode? What was he communicating that got lost in translation? That can be a fruitful question to ask in various situations. Stop demanding proof for everything. There are many things in reality that cannot be proven. That doesn't make them false. That's just the nature of reality. And also stop trying to prove everything to others too. There are many aspects of life that you can't prove to another. If they can't understand it, they can't understand it. And that's their own problem, their own limitation. You know, don't start beating a donkey over the head because he can't understand that 1 + 1 = 2. Just realize that that is the donkey's nature. That's where the donkey is at. Meet the donkey where he's at. So he can't understand that 1 + 1 = 2. Beating him over the head with it, cursing at him and judging him and demonizing him is not going to help him. It's only going to piss him off, make him angry. Then he bites you. And lastly, what I want to point out to you here is that really this episode and the next episode that I have planned about abstraction, I hope to release that after this one. They're going to sort of dovetail together. They're laying the foundation for not only understanding what understanding is, but they're laying the foundation for what is called vision logic or post-rationality. There's the pre-rational, there's the rational, and then there's the post-rational. The post-rational is not irrational. It includes the ability to be rational about things, but it goes beyond. It's also transcendental. You can call it trans-rational as well as post-rational. Same thing. Vision logic is the ability to have logical thinking, but not to be so limited by that logical thinking that it's also visionary. It's highly, highly intuitive. That's what you want to be working towards. And so I'll have more episodes in the future to help you to understand what vision logic is and maybe how to practice it more. There's a lot that could be said about that, but we're just starting to kind of like lay a foundation for it. So now you're starting to understand vision logic is that kind of logic which is not purely explicit, but recognizes the implicit, the transcendent, and learns the art of sort of tangoing with the transcendent. Because you can't grasp a hold of the transcendent in the same way that you can with the non-transcendent stuff. See, it's a different way of dealing with reality, of thinking about reality. It's more like, you might say, it's kind of a fuzzy logic. Not a strict formal logic, but fuzzy logic. That's actually a thing. They have a whole subfield of logic, which is called fuzzy logic. Kind of interesting. So yeah. So there you go. The question is now, do you understand what was said here? And if you do understand, what is that? What is understanding? What did you understand from this episode? How did you understand it? What is that thing that you understood? Understand? Maybe not. Contemplate it. Contemplate what understanding is. Try to locate understanding in your direct experience. Don't think about understanding so much as observe yourself in the process of understanding or in the process of struggling to understand. That's also useful. So if you didn't understand anything here and you feel all confused and misunderstood, then look at that, observe that, and wonder, so what is misunderstanding then? Because if you can understand what misunderstanding is, that's a form of understanding. And there you go. That's a roundabout way of understanding understanding. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Please click that like button for me. You can support me on Patreon if you like this kind of work. Go to patreon.com/actualize for your donations. I'm really grateful for those. It helps to give me a little bit more peace of mind with this work that I'm doing. It allows me to invest more time and effort into doing research so that I don't have to be constantly putting out as much content, so that my content can be better and deeper, and it doesn't have to be as dumbed down as it would be if I didn't have an independent source of income and I had to like always be trying to sell you something or advertise something to you. So I'm really grateful for being able to have that kind of financial independence that Patreon offers. So thank you for that. And what do I want to say here as a final thought? Yeah, every one of my episodes requires very careful reading between the lines. So much is left unsaid. And so one of the lessons I hope you learn from this episode that you apply to all my other videos that you watch in the future is that when you watch my future videos, you're going to watch them more carefully, trying to read more between the lines, trying to, intuitively pick up on what's being communicated. It's not so much about the words that I'm saying that are important. It's what I'm trying to get across to you. It's the essence of what the words are trying to point to. Again, it's the finger pointing to the moon. Don't pay attention to the finger. Pay attention to the moon that it's pointing at. At the same time, even though I say that, I have to, again, qualify it here again because there's a trap. Because when I tell you to read between the lines, there's also the other danger. You could swing the pendulum too much in the other direction. So you can be too literal with the teachings. That's bad. Or you could swing too much in the other direction where you start to read so much between the lines that you start to project all of your own personal biases and fears and ego stuff into what I'm teaching and saying. So you might be so paranoid. It's like, oh, well, Leo said this and this. Does that mean something there? Like this? Like, like for example, I released those episodes that I release about me in my living room there when I'm, taping one of my awakenings or something. People see the 3 symbols behind me in the back of the decoration. And they say, oh my God, it's a 666. What does it mean? What does it all mean? Is this a secret Illuminati thing or is it a devil thing? What is Leo trying to teach us a hidden lesson? What? Oh my God, explain it to us. And it literally means nothing. Your mind reads it as 666. Until you guys told me it's 666, I didn't even notice it. I've had it there for years, didn't even notice it. It means absolutely nothing. See, so sometimes, as they say, a cigar is just a cigar. Not everything has meaning. In fact, all the meanings are projected there by your mind. So be very careful, because if you're starting to, if you have a paranoid mind, you start to read between the lines of everything, your mind is going to show you exactly what you expect to see. Whatever your self-biases are, whatever your worldview is, your mind will see that in my teachings. If you're a devil, you're going to use my words to deepen your devilry. So be careful. That's always been the problem with spiritual teachings from the very beginning of civilization. There have been spiritual teachings, but the people who are reading these teachings, they either read them way too literally, missing the essence of them, or they misinterpret them according to their own paranoid, self-biased projections and needs and fears, and then they distort the teachings and apply the teachings to do enormous evil. Those are, two ends of the spectrum, two traps, two extremes that are traps, and then, striking the right balance. That's an art form. Being able to read a spiritual text or listen to a spiritual teaching and to try to suss out and grasp exactly what the teacher was intending for you to get. Not necessarily what he said, but what he intended you to get. That's the key. So when you're reading the Bible, it doesn't matter what the Bible says. What matters is, did you get the essence of what was intended as the purpose of these writings by the mystics who wrote them? If not, then the whole exercise of reading the Bible is completely useless. In fact, it's worse than useless. It's gonna deepen your devilry. So keep that in mind, and make sure you stay tuned for the next episode, which should be about abstraction. If it's not going to be the exact next one, it might be one or two, into the future. So maybe wait a few weeks. It's going to come out. It's really going to be like a part two and build on top of everything we built upon here.